Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Murder Behind Closed Doors, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. A Deadly Secret Unveiled. The rain was relentless, tapping against the windows like the desperate cries of someone trapped. Inside the old manor, the heavy air of mystery hung thick, as if the walls themselves knew something they weren't letting on. A shadow moved through the darkened hallway, the faintest creak of floorboards betraying their presence. But it wasn't a person. It was a secret, one buried deep beneath layers of deception and silence, a secret that would soon claw its way into the light. Detective Hercule Poirot stood in the center of the room, his piercing gaze sweeping over the guests, his mind already working in overdrive. The victim, a wealthy businessman named Victor Duval, had been found in his study, a study locked from the inside, the door bolted shut from the inside, the windows secured. No signs of forced entry, no visible struggle, nothing except for a single, bloodied letter opener driven deep into his chest, and the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. A mysterious death, a locked room, and now a house full of suspects. Poirot had seen it all before, but something about this case felt different. There was an underlying current, a pulse of fear, of something dark and forbidden that threatened to swallow them all. The first suspect was Eleanor Duval, the widow, draped in a veil of sorrow. Her tear-streaked face hid nothing, yet everything, was it grief or guilt? Her alibi was solid. She had been in the garden, reading a letter from her late sister, according to the staff. But could a grieving widow be so easily absolved of suspicion? Poirot's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than he intended, but he didn't let the doubt settle. Then there was Vincent, the younger brother. Handsome, charming, but always a little too smooth, a little too perfect. He had been alone in the library, reading a book. According to the maid, it was a flimsy alibi at best. But then again, how many witnesses did one need in a house full of rooms and empty promises? What Vincent lacked in sincerity, he made up for with his quiet confidence. Too confident, Poirot thought. The third suspect was Angela, the housekeeper, hardly a suspect in any normal case. But she had been with the family for years. She knew the house, the secrets, the people. There were whispers about her relationship with Victor. Could it have been more than just a professional connection? Her sharp, calculating eyes never strayed too far from the others, but she remained oddly calm in the face of tragedy. A little too calm. Poirot turned his attention to the final figure in the room, Simon Grant, the family lawyer. He was the last person to have seen Victor alive, having come to deliver a contract for a new business venture. Simon's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, a nervous tic that betrayed his usually collected demeanor. Was it fear, or was he hiding something else? He had been the one to find Victor's body after all. Was that too much of a coincidence? Each person, each alibi, each passing moment was a piece of the puzzle. But the more Poirot observed, the more the puzzle seemed to shift. Nothing was adding up. Every lead felt like a false trail, every clue a trick. In his mind, the pieces were all there, but they didn't fit. I will find the truth, Poirot murmured under his breath, though the words were for himself as much as anyone else. The weight of the mystery pressed against his chest, and he felt it in the pit of his stomach. Something was hidden here. Something was deliberately being kept out of sight. A sudden shriek from the direction of the study broke the tense silence. Poirot turned swiftly, his mind racing. The door to the study had been locked from the inside, and yet, that scream, it wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of realization. A scream that sent shivers down his spine. He was already moving toward it before he knew what he was doing. The others followed closely behind, their expressions varying from confusion to genuine concern. Eleanor's face had gone pale, her hands trembling as they clutched each other. Simon, however, was already speaking, his words frantic, almost desperate. "It's impossible. I don't understand." Poirot stepped into the study, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. The desk, the chairs, the blood-stained floor, everything was exactly as it had been. But there, lying beside Victor's body, was something that hadn't been there before, a small, delicate locket, one that Poirot immediately recognized. It belonged to Eleanor. She had worn it around her neck earlier that evening, but now it was here, hidden under the victim's hand, as if it had been placed there on purpose. A silence settled over the room. Poirot's mind was already spinning, considering the impossible. The locket, it was meant to mislead. Someone had set this up. But why? What did it mean? He looked up at Eleanor, his eyes narrowing. "Mademoiselle Duval, might I inquire as to how your locket found its way into the hands of the deceased?" Her face twitched, a flicker of something passing across her features, something sharp, something guarded. She took a step back, her lips trembling, but she didn't answer. Her gaze flitted to the others, as if searching for someone to speak for her, but no one did. The room was heavy with the unsaid, with the weight of hidden truths. Poirot, however, wasn't fooled. This was no mere coincidence. The locket wasn't just a trinket. It was a message that someone wanted him to find. But who and why? His mind turned back to the guests, to the shadows behind their eyes, to the fear lurking just beneath the surface. There was a deadly game being played here, and each player had a role to fill. But the question remained, who was the true murderer, and who was hiding behind the mask of innocence? As Poirot continued to piece the puzzle together, the tension in the room grew unbearable. Every minute felt like a ticking clock, every movement a step closer to the truth. But the more he uncovered, the further the mystery seemed to retreat, like a ghost slipping through his fingers. Then, as he studied the locket once more, a sudden thought struck him. He knew who had placed it there. It was the one person who had been most eager to deflect suspicion, the one who had been too quiet, too composed. Simon Grant, the lawyer. Poirot's heart raced. Could it be? Had Simon orchestrated this entire charade? Had he planned everything down to the smallest detail? The locket, the locked door, the false alibis. Everything had been a carefully crafted lie. Poirot's gaze hardened. "Monsieur Grant," he said slowly, his voice like ice, "it was you, wasn't it?" Simon's face drained of color, and for the first time, the mask cracked. In a flash, he lunged for the door, but Poirot was already there, blocking his path. The truth had been unveiled. Simon collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I had no choice." The rest of the room stood frozen, their shock palpable. But Poirot was beyond shocked. The reveal had been simple, yet devastating. Simon had been playing them all. But why? And how far had he gone to cover his tracks? As the detective closed in on the final moments of the mystery, the entire manor seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next twist. And then in the stillness, Poirot's voice cut through the silence like a knife. The dead speak, but sometimes they speak through the living. With that, the final, unexpected revelation would leave them all reeling, and the dead would remain silent no more. Chapter 2. The first clue, a silent witness. The air in the manor had grown colder. Each breath felt heavier, as if the house itself had absorbed the terror of its former occupant, Victor Duval. The storm outside still raged, but inside, the silence was even more deafening. A sense of unease clung to every room, like the dust on the furniture. But it wasn't just the storm. It was the tension. The truth, or what was left of it, hung in the air, waiting to be uncovered. Detective Hercule Poirot stood at the threshold of the study, his sharp eyes scanning the scene once more, taking in every minute detail. The bloodstains, the position of the body, the locket. But none of these were the first clues. No, the first clue had been hiding in plain sight. The room was filled with nervous energy. Simon Grant, the family lawyer, had been arrested just hours before. He had admitted to the crime, or so it seemed. His confession had been swift, almost too swift. His words had been laced with desperation. But Poirot, being Poirot, wasn't ready to accept that the puzzle had been solved so easily. He needed to dig deeper. So he had returned to the study, his mind working tirelessly to uncover the smallest of details that could break the case wide open. And that's when he noticed it. A chair, positioned just slightly out of place near the far wall. It was small, insignificant even, yet Poirot's trained eyes saw it immediately for what it was. A witness. A silent witness. The chair had been pushed back too far, almost as if someone had gotten up in a hurry. But it was more than just that. The indentation in the seat, the faint smudge on the armrest, it was enough to make Poirot pause. The chair wasn't where it should have been. It had been moved, and someone had been sitting there when Victor Duval had been killed. Poirot turned to face the others. "Do you see it?" he asked, his voice calm, but with a sharpness that made everyone stop and look. This chair, it was not like this before. Someone was here. The room fell silent. The suspects, who had been lingering near the door or shifting nervously, exchanged glances. Eleanor Duval, still draped in her veil of mourning, looked confused, but her eyes darted quickly to the chair and then back to Poirot. Vincent, the younger brother, looked less surprised, though his brow furrowed slightly, as if trying to piece together a puzzle he hadn't quite grasped. Angela, the housekeeper, was already making excuses in her mind, trying to dismiss the clue as irrelevant. But Poirot wasn't fooled. The chair wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a sign, and it was pointing towards someone. Poirot knelt down, inspecting the chair more closely. He noticed something else, something he hadn't seen before. A single, barely perceptible hair strand, dark and curled, caught on the edge of the armrest. It wasn't Victor's, it wasn't anyone else's either. And that was the first revelation. It belonged to someone else, someone who had been close to the victim in the moments before he died. "Who was here?" Poirot asked again, his eyes scanning the room. "Who was close enough to touch this chair?" Eleanor's face tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Vincent shifted uncomfortably, the tension in his jaw betraying his calm exterior. And Angela, the housekeeper, was staring down at the floor, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the door frame. Poirot's gaze turned cold. "You are hiding something," he murmured, his voice barely audible, but it was enough to send a ripple through the group. "All of you. You know something I do not. You know who this chair belongs to." A long pause followed. No one spoke. The storm outside roared louder, like a warning. But it was the sudden, sharp gasp from Angela that broke the silence. She stepped forward, her face pale, her voice trembling as she spoke. It wasn't me. I didn't move it." Poirot nodded slowly, acknowledging her words, but not letting her off the hook. "No, you did not, but someone did, and that someone is hiding behind a mask of innocence." He stood up and walked slowly to the window, his mind racing. The chair, the hair, the positioning, it all pointed to one thing. Someone had been there in the moments leading up to Victor Duval's death. But who? And why had they tried to cover it up? The pieces were starting to come together, but the puzzle was still missing vital parts. Poirot needed to dig deeper. He turned back to the suspects. "Let us start again. Slowly, step by step. Who saw what? Who was in the house? Who could have had access to this room?" The tension in the air thickened. Vincent spoke first, though his voice was shaky. I don't know anything about a chair, Poirot. I was in the library like I told you." Eleanor nodded, almost too eagerly. "I was in the garden. You know that, detective. I was reading, alone." Poirot's eyes narrowed. Their alibis were simple, and yet Poirot couldn't help but wonder, could they be hiding something more than just the truth about their movements? Were they all being truthful, or was there more to their stories than they cared to admit? Angela spoke again, her voice quiet, but filled with a subtle bitterness. "I was in the kitchen. You can ask anyone. I was preparing dinner when the news came. I didn't see anything strange." But Poirot was already shaking his head. "None of you know the truth. None of you see the bigger picture. You are all lying to me, and perhaps more importantly, to yourselves." There was no other way to explain it. Someone had been in the room, and someone had tried to cover their tracks. The question was, why? And more importantly, who had the most to gain from silencing Victor Duval? Poirot's eyes flicked to each suspect. The tension was palpable, but then something unexpected happened. Simon Grant, the lawyer, spoke up. His voice was ragged, as though it had taken everything in him to speak. I wasn't in the room when it happened, but I know who was." Everyone turned to him. He wasn't supposed to know anything. He had been arrested. He had confessed to the crime. And yet here he was, speaking with an authority that felt real. His words had weight. "It was Eleanor," Simon said, his voice trembling. "It was her. I know because I saw her leave the study just before Victor was killed." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's a lie," she cried, her face flushing with anger. "I was in the garden. I wasn't anywhere near the study." But Simon wasn't done. "You were wearing a coat, a dark coat. I saw you slip into the study, and I saw you leave. I didn't know what to think, but when the body was found, I knew. You had to have been there." Eleanor's face went deathly pale. "You're lying. You're trying to frame me," she screamed. But Poirot stood motionless, processing what he had just heard. It was the first real lead. Simon's testimony, though shocking, was too specific to ignore. The storm raged on outside, but inside, The tension reached its peak. Poirot took a deep breath. "It is not over," he said softly, his voice laced with finality. "We are just beginning to uncover the truth. But make no mistake, someone here is guilty, and their secret will be revealed soon enough." The room was silent, each person looking at the other, unsure who to trust. But Poirot's mind was already a step ahead. He had the first clue, and he would follow it until the truth was exposed. Whoever thought they could escape the darkness of Victor Duval's murder would soon learn that no one could hide from their past. And the silent witness? It had just spoken. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark. The mansion was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that made your skin crawl, made every creak of the floorboards sound like a whisper from the beyond. Outside, the storm had died down, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Detective Hercule Poirot stood in the center of the grand hallway, his piercing gaze fixed on the shadows. There was something about this place, the way it seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The case was unraveling, but not in the way Poirot had expected. Every step forward seemed to lead him 2 steps back, and every answer only spawned more questions. The first clue had led him to Simon Grant, the lawyer, but the truth was far from clear. The locket, the chair, the hair, what did it all mean? How did it all fit together? Poirot's mind raced, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was hiding in plain sight. There was a game being played here, a game of deception. And in this mansion, where every corner held a secret, the shadows were the true players. He needed to understand them. He needed to listen. He turned and glanced at the group, the suspects who had once been so confident in their innocence, now visibly unsettled. Eleanor Duval, the widow, had become a shell of the woman she had once been. She was pale, her eyes sunken with exhaustion, but beneath the sorrow, Poirot could see something else. A flicker of fear, a tremor in her voice whenever she spoke. Was it guilt, or was she being manipulated? Vincent, her brother-in-law, was no better. His usual charm had dissolved into a strained facade, as if he were desperately trying to keep it together. His answers were quicker now, less measured, as if he couldn't bear the pressure anymore. And Angela, the housekeeper, her eyes never left Poirot, watching his every move as if she knew something that the rest of them didn't. And then there was Simon, who had been arrested, yet still carried the look of someone who knew the truth, yet wasn't ready to reveal it. But there was something darker lurking beneath the surface, something none of them were prepared to confront. A presence in the house, a presence that couldn't be ignored. Poirot had made it a point to return to the study, where Victor Duval had met his end. The chair, the locket, the odd clues, all of them told him one thing. The answer was close, too close, and yet every time he tried to close in on it, he was met with a wall. The truth was elusive. Like a shadow, it slipped through his fingers, only to reappear somewhere else in the dark. And then there were the whispers. At first, Poirot thought it was his imagination, the house playing tricks on him. But then, in the dead of night, as he lay in his bed, he heard it, a faint murmur, barely audible over the wind. A voice, a whisper, coming from somewhere deep within the mansion. It was the kind of whisper that sent chills crawling up your spine, that made you question if you were truly alone. Poirot's mind began to race. Was it a trick of the wind, or was it someone trying to send him a message, Someone trying to tell him the truth? The next night, Poirot followed the sound of the whispers. He walked silently down the long corridors, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath him. Every shadow seemed to stretch further than it should, every creak of the floorboards louder than the last. The house seemed to be alive, holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. He reached the source of the whispers, the cellar door. It was ajar, just a crack, but enough for him to see a faint light flickering inside. The whispers grew louder. Words, voices. They were coming from below. Slowly, Poirot descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder the further he went. A damp, musty smell filled his nose. The light at the bottom of the stairs flickered again, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Poirot reached the bottom. His eyes scanned the dimly lit room, searching for the source of the voices. And then he saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the cellar, cloaked in darkness. But it wasn't just any figure, it was a woman. Her face was hidden in shadow, but Poirot could see the outline of her silhouette, the sharp curve of her cheekbones, the way her hair cascaded down in waves. She was still, unmoving, as if waiting for something or someone. The whispers stopped the moment Poirot stepped into the room. Silence. Deep, suffocating silence. "Who are you?" Poirot asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. The woman didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, her back to him. Poirot took another step forward. "What do you know? Why are you hiding here in the dark?" Still no answer. And then, with a sudden jarring movement, the woman turned to face him. Poirot's breath caught in his throat. It was Eleanor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but it was her expression that made Poirot freeze. It was not the look of a grieving widow. It was something darker, something more dangerous. She wasn't just hiding in the dark. She was hiding something. Eleanor took a step toward him, her eyes darting to the door. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're not supposed to know." Poirot's heart raced. "Know what, mademoiselle? What are you hiding?" For the first time, Eleanor's eyes flickered with something that could only be described as regret. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot stepped closer. "Tell me. Now." Eleanor took a shaky breath. "Victor didn't die because of money. It wasn't about the business. It wasn't about me. It was about what he knew, about what he found." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Poirot didn't need to ask more questions. He knew. Victor had known something that had led to his death. Eleanor's face contorted in a mixture of grief and fear. "I tried to stop him. I tried to keep him from digging. But he wouldn't listen. He couldn't stop. He was too close to the truth, Poirot. Too close." Poirot's mind raced. What truth, mademoiselle? What truth was Victor trying to uncover? But Eleanor only shook her head, her hand trembling as she clutched her chest. It was my brother, Vincent. He's the one. He's the one who killed him." The words hit Poirot like a thunderclap. "Vincent?" he repeated, stunned. "Your brother?" Eleanor nodded, her face crumpling in anguish. "He found out that Victor had discovered the family's darkest secret, the one that could destroy us all. Vincent, he had to do it. He had no choice." Poirot stood still, processing the revelation. What secret, Eleanor? What was it? But before she could answer, the cellar door slammed shut with a deafening crash. Poirot spun around, his heart racing. Vincent stood at the top of the stairs, a wicked smile curling on his lips. "You're too late, Poirot. You've uncovered too much." And then, with a single, chilling glance, he stepped back into the shadows, leaving Poirot with more questions than answers. The truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. And the final reveal would be something no one, not even Poirot, could have predicted. The whispers in the dark had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Locked Room. Mystery. The sound of the thunderstorm had faded, but the darkness in the manor had only grown. With every passing hour, it seemed as though the house itself was watching, waiting, as if it had become alive with its own secrets. The heavy scent of rain hung in the air, mixing with the tension that now clung to every inch of the manor's once gleaming walls. Nothing was as it seemed. Nothing had ever been. Poirot had seen enough. He had walked the halls of the Duval mansion, talked with the suspects, heard their alibis, observed their every movement, and yet something felt off. The answer remained elusive, like smoke slipping through his fingers. He'd thought he had it before, but now doubts crept in. Was Simon Grant guilty? Was Eleanor hiding something darker than grief? And Vincent, the cold, calculating Vincent, he was hiding something too. But what? It wasn't until Poirot returned to the study that he felt the first stirrings of real understanding. The study, where it had all begun, the room where Victor Duval had been murdered, where the mysteries of the night had begun to unfold. Everything pointed to that room, yet nothing added up. How could someone kill in a locked room? How could the murderer escape without a trace? The door had been locked from the inside. The window bolted shut. No other entry point. Yet Victor had died. That was the riddle Poirot needed to solve. He stood in the doorway now, staring at the room. His eyes took in every detail. The bloodstains, the overturned chair, the untouched desk. Nothing had changed. The room was as it had been the first time he had entered. Nothing, yet everything. He stepped inside. The creak of the floorboards under his weight, the only sound in the stillness. His eyes fixed on the desk, the chair, the small stack of papers. Nothing unusual, but then again, nothing had ever been usual here. He walked to the window, studying the lock, inspecting every inch of it. Secure. No signs of tampering. His gaze flicked to the door. It was solid, unyielding. Nothing to suggest anything had been forced. Poirot turned. Whoever did this, did it without leaving a single trace, he muttered under his breath. But it's impossible. A locked room. A perfect crime. Yet, no one escapes the truth. He walked over to the desk and carefully picked up the letter opener. The blood was dry now, but Poirot could still feel the weight of the weapon in his hand, the sharpness of the steel. It had been the weapon of choice, but why? Why a letter opener? It was so insignificant. It didn't match the gravity of the crime. But then again, that's what made it perfect. That's what made the crime seem so clean, so impossible. Suddenly, he heard it. A faint click, like a lock turning. Poirot froze. His heart skipped a beat. The sound wasn't in his mind. It was real. He wasn't alone. His eyes darted to the door, the only entry point to the room. He had locked it himself. No one could have entered without him hearing it. And yet, the door was slightly ajar now, just enough to see a shadow on the other side. Poirot's mind raced. Could it be one of the suspects? Had someone been watching him? Was someone trying to stop him from uncovering the truth? Before he could act, the door creaked open further, revealing a figure standing in the hallway. It was Vincent Duval, his face unreadable, his eyes dark, with something that could only be described as fear. "Poirot," Vincent said, his voice low. "You need to leave this room. It's dangerous." Poirot didn't flinch. "Dangerous? Is it, Monsieur Duval? Or is it simply inconvenient?" Vincent stepped into the room, his footsteps slow, deliberate. "You're not seeing the whole picture. You don't understand what you're dealing with." Poirot's mind sharpened, the pieces of the puzzle coming together in an instant. "I understand far more than you think, Monsieur Duval. You and your family have all been hiding something. A secret, yes, but not just any secret. It's much darker than that, isn't it?" Vincent's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're saying." But Poirot wasn't done. He stepped forward, his voice steady, unwavering. "You think I'm blind. You think I can't see what's happening here. Your family is drowning in secrets, Vincent. And you're the one trying to keep them buried." Vincent's lips curled into a small, bitter smile. "You think I'm the killer?" Poirot said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavy. Vincent seemed to brace himself, his posture stiffening. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he spoke again. "You're wrong. It wasn't me. It was Eleanor." The words hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Poirot's eyes widened, but he didn't let his surprise show. "Eleanor?" Vincent stepped back, his face a mask of sorrow and guilt. "Yes, she was the one who did it. She's been hiding it all along. She's the one who killed him." Poirot's mind spun, the new information rattling around in his thoughts. Eleanor? How could it be her? Was she hiding something even darker than grief? The woman had been a puzzle from the beginning, but had she really been capable of murder? He turned to Vincent, his voice cold. "Explain yourself." Vincent let out a sharp breath, as if he were struggling to hold it all in. Eleanor was having an affair, a secret one, with someone Victor didn't approve of. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was when Victor found out. He threatened to expose her, to destroy her, and when she realized he would ruin everything, her marriage, her life, she snapped. She killed him, Poirot. In that room, the locked room. Poirot didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the story Vincent had just laid out. Could it be true? Could Eleanor have really killed Victor in cold blood? But then the nagging question remained. How had she done it? How had she killed him without leaving a single trace of evidence? It didn't add up. Poirot turned back to the study, his eyes scanning every corner of the room again. "You say it was Eleanor, but the locked door, the sealed window, how did she get out? How did she leave without anyone noticing?" Vincent hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. "That's the thing, Poirot. She didn't leave." Poirot turned sharply. "What?" Vincent swallowed hard, his gaze flicking between Poirot and the door. "She was still in the room when I arrived. I saw her. I saw her standing there, staring at Victor's body. She didn't even try to hide it. She just stood there. And when I asked her what happened, she said nothing." Poirot's heart pounded. Could it be? Was it possible that Eleanor had been in the room all along? Had she locked herself in to make it look like a perfect crime? Or was there something else at play here? Suddenly, it hit him. A locked room. A perfect crime. No one had left, but someone had stayed. Poirot turned back to Vincent, his voice now filled with certainty. "The answer isn't in the room. It's behind it. You were the one who locked the door, weren't you, Vincent?" Vincent's face went ashen. I didn't." "You did," Poirot interrupted. "You locked the room to make sure no one could get in. You locked yourself in with her." Vincent's shoulders slumped. I didn't want any of this. But she made me. She said she'd tell everyone about my debts, my past. I was afraid of losing everything." Poirot's eyes darkened. "And so you played the perfect alibi. You locked the door, made it seem like the perfect crime. But it wasn't perfect, was it?" Vincent's voice cracked. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, but she's been hiding something, Poirot. She's been hiding a secret that could destroy us all." Poirot stepped forward, his voice sharp. "And that secret is what, Monsieur Duval?" Vincent's face contorted with fear and regret. "The truth about who really killed Victor. The final revelation was out, and it wasn't who anyone had suspected. It wasn't Eleanor. It wasn't Vincent. It was someone none of them had considered. And the real killer was still hiding in the shadows." Chapter 5. A Killer Among Us. The night felt endless. A heavy fog had rolled in from the sea, thickening the air, wrapping the mansion in an eerie embrace. The storm had subsided hours ago, but the tension in the house remained, growing stronger by the minute. Detective Hercule Poirot paced slowly in the grand hallway, his mind racing. He had uncovered so many lies, so many red herrings, that the truth seemed almost unreachable. It was as if the very walls of the Duval mansion were closing in on him, making it impossible to see the answers clearly. He had examined every detail: the locked room, the whispers in the dark, the hair, the chair, the locket, but each clue seemed to lead to more questions. No one was innocent. Everyone was guilty of something, even if they weren't directly involved in the murder. And with each passing moment, Poirot became more and more convinced that the killer was not the person they had all assumed, the one person who everyone had overlooked, the one person who had been hiding in plain sight. The suspects were all gathered in the drawing room now, each of them wearing their own brand of guilt. Eleanor Duval, the widow, sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes darted nervously from one person to another, as if she were waiting for something or someone to break the silence. Vincent, her brother-in-law, stood near the fireplace, his face an unreadable mask. He had become more agitated in the past few hours, his calm demeanor slipping. Angela, the housekeeper, remained by the window, her eyes fixed on the fog outside, her expression betraying little emotion. Simon Grant, the family lawyer, sat with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together, eyes narrowed in deep thought. All of them were hiding something, but who was hiding the most? Poirot's gaze moved over them, the wheels in his mind turning faster. There was something wrong, something about the way they interacted, or more precisely, the way they didn't. No one was truly looking at each other. No one was talking. It was as if they were all afraid of what might happen if they spoke too loudly, too quickly. The fear of exposure was palpable. But what exactly were they hiding? The room felt too small now, as though the walls were closing in, squeezing the truth out of everyone. Poirot could feel it. Someone here knew far more than they were letting on. Couldn't shake the feeling that the killer was in the room with him, that the person he needed to accuse was standing before him, but he just couldn't see it. Not yet, but he would. He had to. Poirot cleared his throat, and the room went still. Every head turned toward him. I have spent enough time studying each of you. I have observed your actions, listened to your words, and looked into your eyes. I know when someone is lying to me, and one of you is lying. He paused, letting the tension build. The silence was suffocating, like the calm before a storm. Poirot's eyes flicked to Eleanor. Mademoiselle Duval, you have been hiding something from us, something that goes far beyond your grief. You know more than you are letting on. You know who the killer is. Eleanor's face drained of color, her lips trembling. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I don't know what you mean, Poirot. I told you everything. I've been honest. Poirot's gaze remained unflinching. Ah, but honesty, mademoiselle, is a tricky thing, is it not? We hide what we do not want to admit. But it is not just you who has something to hide. Eleanor's panic was evident now, her breath coming faster, her eyes darting to the others. Please, I'm telling the truth. Poirot ignored her and turned to Vincent. Monsieur Duval, your story is full of holes. You have tried to divert attention away from yourself, but I know you are more involved than you let on. You know something about the night of Victor's death, but it is not the secret you wish to protect. It is the truth you are afraid of. Vincent's jaw clenched, his gaze hardening. I've told you everything. I don't know what else you want from me. Poirot's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile. The truth, Monsieur Duval, is always more complicated than we wish it to be. He turned then to Angela, standing by the window, her back slightly hunched, as if she were trying to hide from the world. Ah, and you, Mademoiselle Angela, you have been here the longest, haven't you? The one who knows the most about this house and its inhabitants. But what are you hiding? What do you know about Victor's death? And why have you been so silent? Angela's face remained still, but her eyes flickered briefly to the floor. I have no idea what you mean, Poirot. I have been nothing but loyal to this family. Loyalty, mademoiselle, is a beautiful thing, but it can also be a dangerous weapon when used to hide the truth. Poirot's voice was low, almost a whisper, but every word struck like a thunderclap. He then turned to Simon, whose gaze had never wavered from Poirot's, though the lawyer's expression was cold, calculating. And you, Monsieur Grant, are you really as innocent as you claim? You claim to know nothing, but somehow you always seem to be in the right place at the right time. You were the one who found the body, were you not? The one who called for help. Convenient, don't you think? Simon's lips twitched into a slight smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. I did what any good lawyer would do, Poirot. I acted in the best interests of my client. That is all. Poirot studied him, unblinking. Yes, a lawyer. Always thinking several steps ahead, always playing the angles. But you don't fool me, Monsieur Grant. You have been hiding your own secrets. For a moment, it seemed as if everyone in the room was holding their breath. Poirot could feel the weight of their suspicion, the way they were all trying to read him, to figure out how much he knew. But Poirot knew they were all watching the wrong person. He took a step forward, his voice suddenly calm, almost conversational. You see, there is one thing that none of you have considered, and that is that the killer has been among us the entire time. The one person who has been hiding in plain sight, pretending to be one of us. A gasp echoed through the room. Eleanor's face twisted with confusion. Vincent looked like he was about to speak, but Poirot raised a hand to silence him. The killer is someone who has been playing us all like puppets, someone who has stayed just out of reach, keeping the game going while everyone else scrambled for answers. A killer who has no alibi, no motive, and yet everything points to them. Poirot paused, his gaze sweeping over each suspect, each face frozen in disbelief. But Poirot was no longer uncertain. He knew the truth. "The killer," Poirot said slowly, his voice dropping to a low whisper, "is you, Mademoiselle Angela." Angela's eyes widened in horror, and for the first time, her carefully constructed facade cracked. Her lips trembled, her hands shaking slightly as she stepped back, as if trying to put distance between herself and Poirot. "No, no, you're wrong. You can't." But Poirot wasn't done. "You had access to the house. You knew Victor's routines. You knew everything about the family, and you knew how to move undetected in the shadows. The house was your domain, Angela, and when you killed Victor, you made sure no one would suspect you." Angela's breathing became rapid. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted him to stop. I wanted it all to stop." Poirot's voice softened, but there was no kindness in it. "You were the one who found out about the affair, the one who knew about the family's darkest secrets. You couldn't let it go. You couldn't let them destroy everything you had built, so you took matters into your own hands." Angela's face twisted with anguish, and for a moment she seemed like a broken woman. "I didn't want to kill him, but when I found out what he was planning to do, I couldn't let it happen. I had no choice." Poirot's voice was steady. "There is always a choice, mademoiselle, and you chose to kill." The room went still. The truth hung heavy in the air, suffocating. There was no escape. No one could hide any more. Angela, the quiet housekeeper, the one who had slipped through the cracks unnoticed, was the killer. And the truth had finally come to light. But even as Poirot stood there, watching Angela break down, a chilling thought crossed his mind. If Angela could do this, what else was lurking in the shadows of the Duval mansion? Chapter 6. Deceitful Eyes. Dangerous Lies. The house was suffocating, its walls closing in with every passing moment. There was no escape, no way out, no safe place to hide from the truth that was slowly, relentlessly coming to light. The manor's oppressive silence echoed in Hercule Poirot's mind, drowning out everything else. The heavy weight of the past few days was beginning to take its toll. But it wasn't the house that was suffocating him. It was the lies that had tangled their way into every corner of this place. Lies so twisted, so carefully constructed, that they had made the truth almost impossible to find. But Poirot was close, closer than ever, and he could feel it. The sense that the final piece of the puzzle was within his reach, just beyond the veil of deception. All he had to do was see through the lies, to look into the eyes of the guilty and recognize the truth hidden beneath their deceitful gaze. The storm had passed, but the tension in the air was still thick enough to cut with a knife. The suspects were gathered once more in the drawing room, their faces weary, their eyes wary. Eleanor Duval, the widow, sat in a corner, her hands shaking ever so slightly. Vincent, her brother-in-law, leaned against the wall, his eyes darting nervously between Poirot and the others. Angela, the housekeeper, had been subdued after her confession, her eyes hollow, as though the weight of her actions had drained the life from her, and Simon Grant, the lawyer, was watching everyone with the calculating gaze of a man who thought he was always one step ahead. Poirot studied them all with a piercing gaze. Each one of them was hiding something. He could feel it. They were all playing a dangerous game, but some were better at it than others. And then There was one who had played the game so well that no one had suspected a thing. But now, the cracks were starting to show. The lies were starting to unravel. Madame Duval, Poirot began, his voice calm, but with an edge that made everyone in the room go still. Tell me, what exactly is it that you are hiding? Your grief. Is it genuine, or is it a mask to conceal something far darker? Eleanor's eyes flickered with a hint of panic. I told you everything, Poirot. I've lost my husband. My life. Please, leave me in peace. Poirot's gaze didn't waver. Ah, but you see, Mademoiselle Duval, grief can hide many things. It can hide guilt, it can hide fear, it can even hide love. And that is the one thing that interests me most. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Because, you see, you are not mourning the loss of your husband, are you? You are mourning the loss of your secret. A secret that someone else discovered. A secret that someone threatened to expose. Eleanor flinched, her eyes widening for a split second before she regained her composure. But it was enough. Poirot had struck a nerve. Victor knew, didn't he? Poirot pressed. He knew about your affair. He knew about the man you had been seeing behind his back. But what he didn't know, what he could never have known, is how far you were willing to go to protect that secret. Eleanor's breath hitched. That's not true. I didn't kill Victor. I swear. Poirot raised his hand, silencing her. You didn't kill him, perhaps, but someone did. Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate your fear. Someone who knew how to use your guilt against you. For a moment, the room was silent. The weight of Poirot's words hung in the air like a cloud, suffocating everything else. The others watched, waiting for Eleanor's response, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned away, her face pale, her eyes staring blankly at the wall. The silence was deafening. Poirot turned his attention to Vincent. Monsieur Duval, you have been remarkably quiet during all of this, but there is something in your eyes, something that tells me you know far more than you are letting on. Vincent's face stiffened. What are you implying, Poirot? Poirot's lips curled into a thin smile. I'm implying, monsieur, that you have been hiding behind your own deceit. Your alibi is too clean, too perfect, but you are never as innocent as you pretended to be. Vincent's eyes flashed with anger. I've told you the truth. I was in the library the entire time, alone. Poirot didn't move, his gaze unwavering. And yet, monsieur, you have a habit of looking the other way, of letting the truth slip through your fingers when it's inconvenient. But you cannot escape it forever. Vincent took a step forward, his fists clenching. I don't have time for your games, Poirot. If you think I have anything to do with this, you're wrong. Poirot's eyes never left him. I do not think you are the killer, Monsieur Duval. But you are certainly hiding something you are desperate to protect, and that something will be your undoing. The tension in the room grew thicker, but Poirot's attention shifted once more, this time landing on Angela, the woman who had confessed to the murder, the one who had admitted her role in Victor's death, was standing by the window once again, her gaze lost in the darkened world outside. Ah, Mademoiselle Angela, Poirot said softly, his voice taking on a different tone. You too have been hiding something. Angela stiffened, her shoulders rising in a silent protest. What more could I possibly hide, Poirot? I told you everything. Poirot's gaze softened, but only slightly. You told me what you wanted me to know. But you did not tell me everything. Because you are not as innocent as you appear, mademoiselle. There is more to this story than meets the eye. Angela turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. You have no idea what you're talking about. I've confessed. What else do you want from me? Poirot's eyes sparkled with the gleam of someone who had just uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. I want to know why you were so quick to take the blame, Mademoiselle Angela. Why you were so eager to confess. Did it make you feel better? Or were you trying to protect someone else? The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Angela's face twisted, with a mixture of frustration and guilt. I wasn't protecting anyone, she muttered. I just couldn't bear it any more. Poirot nodded, slowly. No, mademoiselle, you were protecting someone. And that someone is the real killer. The room went deathly still. Eleanor, Vincent, and Simon all turned to look at Angela, as if seeing her for the first time. Her lips trembled, and for a moment she seemed to shrink under their gaze, as if the weight of her secrets had become too much to bear. Poirot's voice was a mere whisper. The real killer, Mademoiselle Angela, is not the person you think it is. The one you have been hiding for so long. The one you've protected at all costs. Angela's eyes widened, her hand clutching at her throat. No, you're wrong. Poirot smiled. The killer is you, Mademoiselle Duval. The room gasped in shock. Eleanor's face went white, her hands shaking as she backed away from Poirot, her eyes wide with disbelief. What are you talking about? Poirot's voice was calm, methodical. It was you all along. You who had everything to gain. You who had the most to lose. You were the one who manipulated Angela. You were the one who knew the truth about Victor's death and used it to your advantage. And when it became too dangerous, when the truth was about to come to light, you killed him. Eleanor staggered back, her eyes darting around the room. No, I didn't. You're wrong. Poirot's eyes locked with hers, his expression unwavering. The lies, mademoiselle, the lies you've told, the deceit in your eyes, they were too perfect. You were the one who killed Victor. You had to protect yourself, to keep your secret safe. Eleanor's face twisted with rage, her voice rising in a frantic scream. You can't prove it. You can't prove anything. Poirot took a step forward, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. I don't need to prove it, mademoiselle. The truth is in your eyes, the deceit in your lies, and now it's too late to hide. As the last word left his lips, the room seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor stood frozen, her eyes wild with panic. But Poirot's gaze was calm, steady. He had uncovered the truth, and it was more shocking than anyone had ever imagined. The killer had been among them all along, and the lies that had kept everyone in the dark had finally unraveled. Chapter 7. The Hidden Motive. The air in the Duval mansion had grown impossibly thick with suspicion. Each corner of the house seemed to whisper secrets, too dark and too dangerous to be fully understood. Hercule Poirot walked through the grand hallway, his eyes narrowing with each step. The house had been a place of grief, of lies, of half-truths. But now, with the murderer exposed, the question remained. Why? What was the true motive behind the death of Victor Duval? What had driven someone to take a life, especially when so many had something to lose? The investigation had revealed plenty. Eleanor's affair, Angela's guilt, the twisted family dynamics, but Poirot knew there was something deeper, something buried in the shadows of this house that no one had yet dared to speak of. The deeper truths were always the hardest to uncover, and in this case, it was clear that everyone in this house had something to hide. But someone had crossed a line. Someone had been driven by something far more powerful than simple anger or jealousy. What lay behind the violence of that night was more than personal animosity. It was a hidden, dangerous force, a force that was tied to a secret so carefully guarded even Poirot himself hadn't realized how close he was to the truth. Poirot's footsteps echoed as he entered the study, the room where it had all begun. The bloodstains on the floor still seemed fresh in his mind. The door had been locked, the windows bolted from the inside, and yet the death had been all too real. Someone had killed Victor Duval in this very room. But now, the mystery felt different. It wasn't just the murder that intrigued Poirot, it was the secret behind the murder, the motive that had driven one of these people to commit such an unforgivable act. The deeper he looked, the more he realized that this case was never just about one man's death. It was about everything Victor had hidden, the secrets that had cost him his life. As Poirot stared out the window, a figure appeared in the doorway. Vincent Duval, looking even more strained than before. He stepped inside without invitation, but Poirot didn't flinch. This family had become a spectacle of hidden truths, and now, it seemed, the truth was finally forcing its way to the surface. "You've been quiet, Monsieur Duval," Poirot said, his voice soft but steady. "But you still haven't told me everything, have you?" Vincent's eyes flickered. "What more do you want from me, Poirot?" "You know the truth," Angela confessed. "You know she killed him." Poirot shook his head slowly. "The truth is never that simple. I know what she did, but I also know that there's more to this story. You are hiding something, something crucial, something that connects all of you to Victor's death." Vincent opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a long moment he stared at the floor. Finally, he spoke. Victor was not the man he seemed to be. You don't understand. What he was doing, what he planned, it would have destroyed all of us. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Destroyed all of you? What are you talking about?" Vincent swallowed hard, his eyes avoiding Poirot's. Victor wasn't just a businessman. He had made some dangerous deals. He was involved in something illegal, something that could ruin the entire family if it came to light. He had been blackmailing me, and Eleanor, and even Angela. We all had secrets, and he knew them all. Poirot listened carefully. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. "Blackmail," he murmured, more to himself than to Vincent. So Victor Duval had gathered leverage on everyone close to him. But why kill him? Why now? Vincent's face was tight with anxiety. Because he was going to expose everything. He had threatened us all. And then he told me something. He said he was going to bring it all to the authorities. He said he didn't care about the consequences anymore. He was ready to ruin us all. Poirot's mind raced. A man who had made his living on secrets, on power, on holding the strings of everyone around him. And now his own web had entangled him. What was it that Victor knew? Poirot asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Vincent hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "It was about our father," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "He was involved in money, laundering, not just a little, a lot. Victor found out after our father died, and he started using it against us. He knew what we had all done, the lies we had all told. He was using our sins as leverage to control us. Poirot felt a cold chill pass through him. The murder was no longer about the betrayal of an affair or a petty argument. It was about survival. It was about a man who had pushed others too far, used too many secrets, and in doing so had condemned himself to death. Victor had been playing a dangerous game of control, but in the end, it was he who had lost. "So you're telling me," Poirot said slowly, his eyes narrowing, "that Victor Duval was blackmailing you all, that he held the keys to your darkest secrets, and yet he still had to die?" Vincent nodded, his face etched with guilt. "Yes, but it wasn't just the blackmail. It was what he was planning to do with it. He was going to expose everything, to ruin us all, to destroy everything our family had built. But the worst part was that he was going to bring the authorities into it. He was going to frame us for things we never even knew about, things that would destroy everything. We couldn't let that happen." Poirot's mind was turning over the new information. It all made sense now. The reason for the murder was not just about greed or jealousy. It was about desperation. Desperation to protect the family's reputation, to keep the past hidden, to bury the darkest of secrets. This was not a crime born of passion. It was a calculated, cold, and deliberate act of survival. Vincent's voice trembled, his eyes pleading. "I didn't kill him. I didn't, but I knew what had to be done. I just didn't know how to stop him without it going too far." Poirot's eyes shifted as he considered Vincent's words. "And that is where you're wrong, Monsieur Duval, because the murder was not just about saving yourselves from the consequences of Victor's threat. It was something more, something darker." Vincent frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Poirot stepped closer, his eyes locking with Vincent's. "You were not the one who killed him, but you know who did. You've been hiding it from me. The one who killed Victor was trying to protect you all, yes. But more than that, they were trying to protect themselves from being exposed, from being destroyed by the very man they once called family." Vincent's face drained of color. Who are you talking about?" Poirot's voice was low, almost a whisper. "The killer is someone who had the most to lose, someone who was closer to Victor than anyone else, someone who had been under Victor's control for years, who feared that their secret would be revealed. It was Eleanor, Monsieur Duval. It was your sister-in-law. She killed him to protect herself." The room went silent. Vincent's mouth went dry, his hands shaking as he processed the revelation. "Eleanor? No, she couldn't have." Poirot nodded. "She had the most to lose. She was not just protecting herself. She was protecting the family's reputation. She was protecting the dark truth of your father's money laundering schemes, of your own sins. Eleanor killed Victor to stop him from tearing everything apart. She was afraid of what would happen if Victor went to the authorities. And she was afraid of being exposed." Vincent's eyes were wide with disbelief. "But she's been so quiet. She seemed so broken. She could never—" Poirot's voice was firm. "The quiet ones are often the most dangerous, Monsieur Duval. They are the ones who hide behind their grief, behind their facade, until they are pushed too far. And Eleanor was pushed too far." Vincent stumbled back, as if the weight of the truth had knocked the air out of him. "No, this can't be true. She was the one who—" Poirot's eyes softened. "The hidden motive, Monsieur Duval, is not always what it seems. Eleanor was not just protecting her own secret. She was protecting you all. And that is what makes it even more tragic. Vincent stood there, frozen in disbelief, as the truth settled over him like a suffocating weight. The truth was far darker than anyone had imagined. The killer was someone none of them had suspected. But now, with the truth exposed, there was no escaping it. And as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, Poirot stood silently, watching as the Duval family crumbled under the weight of their own deceit. They had been hiding the darkest of secrets. But now, those secrets were out, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 8. A Web of Betrayal. The tension in the Duval mansion was palpable, hanging heavy in the air like a storm waiting to break. Each passing hour felt like an eternity. Hercule Poirot stood in the grand drawing room, his sharp gaze sweeping over the faces of the remaining suspects. The house that had once been filled with the laughter of family, with the hum of life, now felt cold, empty. And in its emptiness, betrayal lurked in every shadow. There had been so many lies, so many secrets, twisted and tangled beyond recognition, but none of them had prepared Poirot for what he had just uncovered. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, one by one. But as he pieced together the fragments of truth, he realized something far more disturbing. There was more to this story, more lies, more betrayals. And the worst part? No one was innocent. The door creaked open behind him, and Poirot turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. Vincent Duval entered the room, his face drawn tight, eyes red with lack of sleep, his posture stiff with something darker than fatigue. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. "You've been busy, Poirot." Vincent's voice was rough, the words edged with frustration. "Is it done? Is the truth finally out?" Poirot regarded him silently for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The truth is never simple, Monsieur Duval, but the threads are all connecting now, and what I see is a web of betrayal." Vincent swallowed hard, glancing briefly at the others in the room, his gaze flickering nervously. Eleanor sat near the window, her face hidden in the shadows. Angela stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes distant, as if trying to avoid Poirot's gaze. Simon Grant, the lawyer, sat on the edge of a chair, his face unreadable. Yet there was a tension in his jaw that made it clear he was on the edge of his seat. "It's not just about Victor's death anymore, is it?" Vincent asked quietly, his voice cracking. "You're talking about something bigger." Poirot's eyes never left him. "Yes, Monsieur Duval, a web of deceit that began long before Victor's death. You are all trapped in it, and the threads have been pulled so tight there is no way out." Vincent shifted uncomfortably. "I don't understand. What do you mean? We're all just trying to survive here, Poirot. We've all done what we had to do." Poirot's expression darkened, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to grow even heavier. "But survival, monsieur, comes at a price, and that price is often betrayal. The question is not who killed Victor. The question is who betrayed him, and why." The room fell silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of Poirot's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating everything around it. But Poirot wasn't finished. "You see," Poirot continued, his voice low, "Victor was not just a businessman. He was not just a husband or a brother. He was the keeper of everyone's darkest secrets. And each of you, one by one, had something to hide. Something that Victor knew, something that would ruin you. And each of you betrayed him. but not in the way you think. The silence stretched out. Eleanor's hand tightened on the edge of the chair, her knuckles white. Angela looked at the floor, her face taut, her lips trembling slightly. Simon Grant's eyes flicked nervously between Poirot and the others. No one dared to speak. The web was being spun tighter, and with each word Poirot spoke, the truth grew even darker. Poirot took a step forward. "You, Mademoiselle Duval," he said, his eyes locked on Eleanor. "You betrayed your husband, not with an affair, but with your silence. You allowed him to manipulate you. You allowed him to control you with the knowledge of your own shame. You buried your own guilt beneath layers of lies. But when it became too much, when you couldn't hide anymore, you killed him." Eleanor flinched, but she didn't speak. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together, and for the first time, she looked less like the grieving widow and more like someone who was hiding something far worse. Poirot's gaze shifted to Angela. "You, Mademoiselle Angela, betrayed your own sense of loyalty. You were Victor's confidant, his trusted servant, but you knew what he was doing to the family. You knew how he was exploiting their weaknesses, and yet you chose to help him. You chose to stand by him. You chose to protect his secrets, until finally he crossed a line. He threatened to expose you. He threatened to expose all of you." Angela's lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes were wide with fear. Her hands shook at her sides. But Poirot knew. He could see it in her eyes. The guilt, the regret, the fear. "And you, Monsieur Grant," Poirot continued, his voice steady, but his eyes cold. "You betrayed your profession, your integrity, your very oath to the law. You allowed Victor to use you as his shield. You helped him hide his crimes, his dealings, his manipulations. You thought you were safe, that your loyalty would keep you in his good graces. But Victor was a man of many faces, and one of those faces was the face of a man who would throw you under the bus the moment it suited him." Simon Grant's face turned pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was caught in the lies he had so carefully constructed. And now, with nowhere to hide, the truth was crashing down on him. Poirot turned back to Vincent. "And you, Monsieur Duval," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You betrayed your own family. You allowed your brother's manipulations to take root in your soul. You allowed him to control you, to play you like a pawn in his game. But you knew the risks. You knew what Victor was capable of. And when he pushed you too far, when he threatened everything you held dear, you found a way to silence him." Vincent's face twisted in agony. "I didn't kill him, Poirot. I didn't, but I helped." Poirot's gaze softened, just for a moment. "Yes, you did, Monsieur Duval. You helped him die. You may not have killed him with your own hands, but you killed him with your complicity, with your silence. You let him destroy the people you loved because you were too afraid to stand up to him." Vincent's breath came out in a ragged gasp. He stepped back, his face full of disbelief. No, that's not true. I was trying to protect the family. I was trying to keep everything from falling apart. I never wanted any of this to happen." Poirot's voice hardened. "And that is the tragedy of it all, monsieur. You thought you were protecting them, but in truth, you were all destroying each other. The web you wove was one of betrayal, of deceit, of manipulation. And now, it has all come undone." Vincent's shoulders slumped. He could no longer deny the truth. The web had ensnared them all. The lies they had told, the secrets they had kept, the betrayals they had committed, None of it could be undone. The price of survival had been too high. The room was deathly quiet as Poirot stepped back, his eyes scanning the faces of the family. There were no more words to be said, no more lies to be told. They had all been caught in the web of betrayal. And now they would all pay the price. But there was one more thing, one more revelation that Poirot had to make. He turned to face them all. The killer, Poirot said softly, his voice almost a whisper, was never about a single crime. It was about a family bound by secrets and lies, a family whose survival depended on betrayal. And when the truth finally came out, when the web of deception unraveled, the killer was not one person. It was all of you. You all betrayed each other, and that is why Victor Duval had to die. A chill ran through the room as the truth settled over them like a blanket of ice. The killer had been everyone, and in the end, no one had been innocent. Poirot turned and walked toward the door, leaving the Duval family behind, their lives shattered by the weight of their own betrayal. The web had been unraveled, and there was no going back. The truth had been revealed, and the consequences would be felt for years to come. As Poirot stepped into the hallway, he paused for a moment, turning back to look at the house one last time. The mansion that had been the stage for so much deceit, so much betrayal, was now silent. And in that silence, he could almost hear the echoes of the lies that had been told. And the final thought that passed through his mind was simple. There was no such thing as a perfect crime, only a web of betrayal that eventually caught everyone in its trap. Chapter 9. Murder or Mistake. The clock ticked steadily in the silence of the mansion, its rhythm a constant reminder of the time running out. The air was heavy with dread, thickened by the weight of secrets that had been buried for far too long. Hercule Poirot stood in the center of the grand hall, his mind racing as he stared at the faces before him. Each of them wore a mask of grief, of guilt, of confusion. But behind those masks, Poirot knew the truth was lurking. The truth about Victor Duval's death. The question that had plagued them all remained. Was it murder, or was it a mistake? The room seemed colder now, as though the shadows themselves were waiting, listening, preparing to reveal something even darker. The tension was unbearable, every second stretching on endlessly. The suspects, Eleanor, Vincent, Angela, and Simon, stood together like actors on the verge of a performance. But this was no play. This was a real-life nightmare, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. In this house, one of them was guilty. But who and why? Poirot had spent days unraveling the threads of lies, betrayal, and deception. Each clue had led him down a new path, only to find it dead-ended in more confusion. But now, after all the twists and turns, he could feel the truth just beyond his grasp. And yet there was something about this case, a nagging feeling that refused to let him rest, that told him the truth would be far more complex than a simple confession of guilt. He turned toward Eleanor first, her face still pale from the grief of losing her husband. But beneath the sorrow, Poirot could see something else, fear. She was afraid, but what was she afraid of? Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped, revealing a flicker of something more, something far darker. Mademoiselle Duval, Poirot began, his voice calm but firm. You have told us that you loved your husband. You have told us that you grieve his death. But I must ask you, what did you truly know about him? What did you know about his dealings, his actions behind closed doors? Eleanor's hands trembled slightly, but she refused to break eye contact. I knew he wasn't perfect. I knew he had his faults, but I never imagined he could be a danger to anyone. He was always trying to protect us. I swear, I didn't know anything more. Poirot watched her closely. You knew enough to be afraid. You knew enough to hide your own secrets. You told me yourself that Victor was controlling, but control is a dangerous thing. And sometimes, when someone controls everything, there's nothing left for the people around them to hold on to. Eleanor stiffened, her eyes darting to the others in the room. I didn't want him dead. I didn't want this. Poirot's gaze shifted to Vincent, who had been quiet since they first gathered in the room. His posture was tense, his jaw clenched, as though he was trying to hold something back. The air between them felt thick, like an unspoken accusation. Monsieur Duval, Poirot said, his voice cutting through the silence, what do you think? Is your sister-in-law telling the truth? Was it really just a tragic accident? Vincent didn't look at Eleanor. Instead, his eyes stayed fixed on Poirot. I don't know, he muttered. I don't know what to believe anymore. The house is full of lies. The more I try to understand, the more confused I get. Poirot nodded, slowly, his expression thoughtful. Lies are dangerous things, monsieur. They don't just twist the truth, they twist the people who tell them. And the more lies you tell, the harder it becomes to know which is the truth. The tension in the room mounted. Angela, who had been standing silently by the fireplace, shifted slightly. Her eyes flickered nervously between Poirot and the others. She had been the one to confess her role in Victor's death, but something about her confession felt incomplete. She hadn't told the whole story, and Poirot wasn't about to let her off the hook. Mademoiselle Angela, Poirot said, his voice steady, you told us you killed Victor in a moment of fear and regret. But there is something else, something you haven't revealed yet. You've been hiding something, haven't you? Angela's eyes widened slightly. She stepped back, her hand instinctively going to her throat. I told you everything. I didn't mean to. But you did. Poirot interrupted. You did mean to. You may not have planned to kill him, but you wanted him gone. You wanted the power he held over you to disappear. You wanted to be free of the grip he had on you and your past. Angela's breath caught in her throat. She swallowed hard, the weight of Poirot's words pressing down on her. I didn't want it to go this far. I didn't mean for him to die. Poirot's eyes were piercing now. Didn't you? Or did you not have the strength to stop it once it started? You were complicit, Mademoiselle Angela. You knew what was happening, and when it became too dangerous, when you feared he would destroy you, you made the choice. The room fell silent again, the air thick with the weight of the truth. But Poirot wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Simon Grant, the last remaining suspect, sitting quietly in the corner, watching them all with an expression that bordered on indifference. Monsieur Grant, Poirot said, his voice almost casual, you have been the one who found the body. You've been the one to guide us through the legal complexities. But there is something more to you, isn't there? A hidden connection to the Duval, a connection that no one has acknowledged. Simon's eyes flicked to Poirot, his face hardening. I don't know what you're talking about. Poirot smiled slightly. I believe you do. You've been very careful to stay out of the line of fire. But I've noticed something about you, Monsieur Grant. You've been playing a very dangerous game. And now, it's time for you to admit the truth. Did you have something to do with Victor's death? Simon's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He opened his mouth, but for a moment, no words came out. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "No, I didn't kill him, but I knew what he was planning. I knew what he was going to do, and I didn't stop him." Poirot's expression didn't change. "You didn't stop him. You allowed him to destroy himself and everyone around him, and you did nothing." Simon's gaze dropped to the floor. "I couldn't stop him. I couldn't stop any of them. They were all bound to their own mistakes, and so was I." Poirot's voice was icy. "And that, Monsieur Grant, is what makes this even worse. You knew the truth. You knew the cost of their lies. And yet, you let them all spiral into this madness, letting the killer take the fall for it all." Simon clenched, his fists tighter. "I tried to protect them. I tried to protect myself, but I couldn't." Poirot stared at Simon for a long moment. "The truth is never simple, Monsieur Grant, but sometimes it is too late to protect anyone." The room fell into a tense silence as the truth hung in the air, suffocating them all. The pieces were coming together, but the final question remained: was it murder, or was it a mistake? Was Victor's death truly planned, or had it been an accident? Had someone snapped in a moment of fear and anger, or had they been driven by something darker, something more intentional? Poirot stood still, his eyes scanning the faces around him. He could feel the weight of the moment, the final piece of the puzzle just within reach. The truth was there, buried beneath all the lies, beneath all the deception. And yet, it still didn't make sense. Not entirely. But then, with a sudden realization, Poirot smiled softly. "Murder or mistake," he whispered to himself. Perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was both. The room gasped in unison, the weight of his words hanging like a final, fatal blow. The truth was not what they had expected. It was something far more complicated, something no one could have predicted. And in the end, it wasn't just about who killed Victor Duval. It was about the web they had all created. The web of deceit, of mistakes, of choices, made long before that fateful night. It was a web they had all been caught in, and in the end, they were all guilty. And that, Poirot realized, was the true tragedy. Chapter 10. The alibi that doesn't add up. The heavy scent of old wood and polished furniture lingered in the air as Hercule Poirot walked through the grand hall of the Duval mansion. Outside, the storm had long since passed, but inside, the tension was palpable. The walls seemed to close in around him as the truth, inching closer with every step, continued to evade him. He could feel it now. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that had eluded him for so long, was almost within his grasp. But one question remained that refused to leave his mind. What if the alibi didn't add up? The alibi. It had been a foundation upon which so many had built their innocence. Each suspect had claimed to be in one place at the time of Victor Duval's death. Each alibi seemed so airtight, so perfect, that it was almost too clean. But Poirot knew better. Nothing in this house, with its hidden rooms, its secrets, and its lies, was ever as simple as it seemed. His eyes flicked over, the faces of the suspects still present in the room. Eleanor Duval, the widow, sat with a cold, composed look, though her eyes, tired and hollow, betrayed the internal turmoil she was trying so desperately to suppress. Vincent Duval, her brother-in-law, stood near the window, his arms crossed, his face locked in an expression of strained contemplation. Angela, the housekeeper, stood by the door, her gaze fixed on the floor, as though she couldn't bear to meet Poirot's eyes. Simon Grant, the lawyer, sat at the table, his fingers drumming nervously, the air of someone who knew far more than he had let on. They were all suspects. All had alibis. But alibis, Poirot knew, were just as easily constructed as lies. And lies, when pieced together, could only lead to the truth if they didn't fall apart under scrutiny. Poirot spoke slowly, deliberately, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. You all have given me your stories, your alibis. You have all placed yourselves in locations far from the scene of the crime. But what if your alibis are false? What if they are not as reliable as you believe? A murmur rippled through the room. Eleanor's face stiffened. Vincent shifted uneasily, glancing toward the door. Angela's eyes flickered up, and Simon Grant, ever the lawyer, seemed to grow even more tense. Poirot's eyes lingered on Simon for a moment longer than necessary. Simon had been an enigma, a man who, on the surface, seemed like a mere bystander in the chaos of the Duval family. But Poirot had long since learned that the quiet ones were the most dangerous. They were the ones who held the most secrets. Monsieur Grant, Poirot said, his voice calm but piercing, you've been the one who discovered the body. You called the police. But I must ask you, did you truly discover it by chance, or were you perhaps the one who had the most to gain from Victor Duval's death? Simon's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening into fists. I've told you everything, Poirot. I wasn't involved in his death. I found the body. It's as simple as that. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. Is it, Monsieur Grant? Is it really so simple? Or are you hiding something? Simon opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He glanced at the others, his eyes scanning their faces, but no one spoke in his defense. Poirot could feel the weight of their silence. They were all holding their breath, each of them wondering if they were next. Poirot shifted his gaze to Vincent, who had remained eerily quiet throughout the conversation. Vincent's alibi had been solid. He claimed to have been in the library, reading when the murder occurred. But Poirot wasn't convinced. There were too many inconsistencies, too many things that didn't add up. The library was too far from the study, too far from the scene of the crime. And Vincent's calm demeanor, his lack of real emotion, seemed far too calculated. Vincent, Poirot said, his voice softer now. You were in the library, yes? Alone. But how do you explain the time gap between when Victor was last seen and when the body was discovered? How do you explain the fact that no one saw you enter or leave the study? Vincent stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he met Poirot's gaze. I didn't leave the library. I told you I stayed there the entire time. Poirot leaned forward slightly. But you did leave, Monsieur Duval. You left the library before the body was discovered. And in that brief window of time, the murder took place. You were alone, and you had no one to vouch for you. Vincent's expression darkened. I don't need anyone to vouch for me. I was alone, yes, but I didn't kill him. Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice was unwavering. You're right, monsieur. You didn't kill him. But you were complicit. You were there, and you saw the opportunity. You saw the chance to end Victor's hold over you. Vincent's face twisted with anger. I'm not a murderer, Poirot. I never wanted him dead. Poirot nodded, but his eyes were sharp. No, but you allowed the conditions for his death to exist. You allowed the lies to fester. You, too, have your part to play in this tragedy. The room fell into a tense silence as Vincent's face flushed with a mixture of anger and guilt. But Poirot wasn't finished. There was one more thread to pull, one more lie to expose. And this one, he knew, would break them all. He turned his attention to Eleanor. The widow who had once seemed so fragile, so innocent, now stood as the centerpiece of the mystery. Her alibi had been airtight. She had been in the garden, reading a letter from her late sister. But Poirot had learned long ago that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. "Mademoiselle Duval," Poirot said, his voice steady but insistent, "you claim to have been in the garden when your husband was killed. But there is something that doesn't quite add up. You say you were reading a letter, but what if you were not alone in that garden? What if someone else was with you?" Eleanor stiffened, her face paling. She opened her mouth to speak, but stopped herself, glancing toward Vincent, then to Simon, as if searching for support. But no one spoke. Poirot's eyes remained fixed on her. "You were not alone, were you, mademoiselle? Someone else was with you, someone who has not been accounted for in your alibi." Eleanor swallowed hard, her hands trembling. I don't know what you mean." Poirot's gaze softened, but there was a quiet determination in his voice. "Someone was with you, and that someone was the person who killed Victor. That's the real truth, Mademoiselle Duval." For a long moment, Eleanor didn't respond. Her eyes flicked to the others in the room, but there was no comfort to be found. Poirot had cracked her facade wide open. The weight of the truth was finally beginning to sink in. "There was someone else," Eleanor said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who had been in the garden with me. It was Simon." The words hung in the air like a bombshell, leaving everyone frozen. Simon's face drained of color, and for a brief moment his eyes flicked toward the door, as if considering an escape. But he knew it was too late. The truth had already come out. Poirot turned toward Simon, his eyes cold. "You were with her, weren't you? You were the one who had the most to lose. You were the one who saw Victor as a threat to your own carefully constructed life. You were the one who would do anything to keep your secrets safe." Simon's lips trembled as he tried to speak, but no words came. His carefully constructed alibi had crumbled, and now he was exposed for what he truly was, a man willing to kill to keep his lies intact. Poirot's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of finality. "You killed him, Simon. You killed Victor to protect your secrets, to protect your power, and you used Eleanor to cover your tracks. You manipulated her just as you manipulated everyone else in this house." Simon opened his mouth, his eyes desperate, but no words escaped. The truth was too much to bear. Poirot stood still, his eyes scanning the room. The web of lies, the false alibis, the deception, it had all come undone. And in the end, it wasn't just one person who had killed Victor Duval. It was the lies, the betrayals, the broken promises that had driven them all to the breaking point. The alibi didn't add up. It never had. The truth was far more complicated. And now it was too late to run. They had all been caught in the web they had spun. Poirot turned and walked toward the door, his voice a soft echo in the silence. "The truth, Mademoiselle Duval, is a dangerous thing, and when it is exposed, it destroys everything." As he left the room, the finality of his words lingered in the air like the stillness after a storm. Nothing would ever be the same again, and the truth had shattered them all. Chapter 11. A shocking revelation. The silence in the mansion was deafening. Every creak of the old wood beneath Poirot's feet echoed like a drumbeat, each step more deliberate than the last. The walls, heavy with the weight of secrets, seemed to watch him, waiting for the truth to break free. And Poirot, always the keen observer, could feel it, the pressure, the tension, the crackling energy of a revelation about to explode. Something was about to change, something that would turn everything they thought they knew on its head. He walked through the darkened hall, his thoughts racing. He'd pieced together the fragments, each suspect's lie, each hidden motive, each betrayal, yet there was still something that didn't make sense. An incomplete puzzle. Something was missing, and it was gnawing at him, clawing at his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. The final piece of the puzzle had always been there, but no one had seen it. Not until now. The mansion felt like a tomb, silent, cold, and brooding. The family members, the suspects, the players in this twisted game were all gathered in the drawing room, their faces pale and weary from the storm of lies that had raged for so long. They were waiting, watching, dreading the moment when Poirot would finally reveal the truth. The final clue had been staring him in the face all along. He could feel it now, as if the house itself was urging him to speak, to confront them all with the revelation they hadn't expected. The room was suffocating with anticipation, but Poirot knew he had to wait. He had to let the tension build to its breaking point. He turned to face them. The suspects, the Duval, the ones who had all played their part in this tragic tale of deception and death. They were all here. Eleanor, her grief-stricken face hiding far more than she let on. Vincent, who had been so quick to defend his innocence, yet so reluctant to admit the truth. Angela, who had confessed, yet was still hiding something. And Simon, the lawyer, the one whose secrets ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. Enough of the lies. Poirot's voice broke through the stillness, cold and direct. The time for pretending is over. There is something you have all overlooked. Something right under your noses that none of you have seen. Eleanor's eyes flickered nervously, but she said nothing. Vincent shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. Angela's gaze was steady, but the flicker of unease in her eyes told Poirot everything he needed to know. Simon remained silent, his face inscrutable, though his fingers drummed restlessly on the armrest of his chair. Poirot continued, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. You have all been hiding the same secret, but none of you have been honest with me, and in your deceit, you have all missed the most obvious clue. There was a collective shift in the room, an uneasy ripple of realization spreading across the faces of the suspects. They were finally listening. They were finally realizing that Poirot wasn't just talking about the lies they had told, the alibis they had fabricated, or the motives they had tried to conceal. He was talking about something much deeper, much more dangerous. And now they were beginning to understand just how far the deception ran. The truth, my friends, Poirot said slowly, his voice gaining strength, is not in the locked room. It is not in the affair, the blackmail, or the lies you have all so carefully constructed. No, the truth is much simpler and much more shocking than that. Eleanor's breath caught, her face pale. Vincent's fingers tightened into fists. Angela, too, looked taken aback, as if the air had just been sucked from her lungs. Simon Grant's eyes, usually so cold and calculating, now seemed to flicker with the hint of something, fear perhaps, a realization of just how deep he had gotten into the web of lies. Poirot allowed the silence to build, the suspense hanging like a sword over them all. He walked slowly, deliberately, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise still room. Then, in a voice that was almost a whisper, he finally spoke the words that had been on the tip of his tongue for days. Victor Duval, Poirot said, did not die by the hand of any of you. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to believe. The room was still. The shock was palpable. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then, the dam broke. "What are you talking about?" Vincent's voice was shaky, his eyes wild with confusion. "You said it was one of us. You said—" Poirot raised a hand to silence him. "I said many things, Monsieur Duval. But what I said and what I have discovered are two very different matters. The truth is, Victor Duval was killed, but not by any of you." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Angela's eyes widened in disbelief. Simon's face had gone ashen. Poirot's eyes locked with each of them, one by one. "The killer is someone none of you suspected. Someone who had a reason to silence Victor, but not for the reasons you think. This is not about money. This is not about revenge. It is about something else entirely. A secret so powerful, so dangerous, that Victor had to be killed to keep it from coming to light." The room seemed to close in around them as Poirot moved towards the center of the room. The silence was suffocating, but Poirot's mind was racing, and he could feel the walls of the mystery beginning to crumble, one piece at a time. "You all know him," Poirot continued, his voice dropping low as if he were unveiling a terrible truth. "You all trust him. He has been here, in this room, this entire time. He has been a part of your lives for years. But the killer is not any of you. It is someone who has been hiding behind the facade of innocence. Someone who knew everything. Victor knew. Someone who could never allow Victor to reveal the secret he had uncovered." The suspects exchanged confused glances, each one wondering who Poirot could possibly be talking about. But Poirot didn't wait for them to ask. Instead, he stepped back, his gaze falling on Simon Grant. "You, Monsieur Grant," Poirot said, his eyes cold and calculating, "you thought you could manipulate the situation. You thought you could stay in control, stay ahead of the game. But you underestimated one thing, one crucial thing." Simon's face drained of color, his lips trembling. "No, I didn't do it. I didn't kill Victor." Poirot shook his head, his expression unyielding. "You didn't kill him, but you helped him die. You were complicit in his death. Because the real killer, the one who had the most to gain, is you." The room exploded in chaos. Vincent stepped forward, his face contorted with disbelief. "What? How could you possibly—" But Poirot didn't let him finish. "It's simple, really. Simon Grant, you were the one who knew the most about Victor's dealings. You knew that Victor had discovered the truth about your past, the truth about the illegal activities you had been involved in for years. The blackmail, the money laundering, the connections to powerful people. Victor had the evidence, and you knew he would use it against you." Simon opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands shook as he tried to form a defense. But there was none. Poirot's voice was steady, final. "You killed Victor, not because of what he did to you, but because of what he knew. You couldn't afford to let him live. You couldn't afford to let him expose you. And so, you did what had to be done." Simon's face was pale, his body trembling. "No, I didn't kill him. I never wanted to." Poirot's gaze remained steady, his eyes piercing through Simon's defenses. "But you did, Monsieur Grant, and you thought you could get away with it. But in the end, the truth always comes to light. For a moment, the room was still. The truth had been revealed, and the weight of it hung heavy in the air. The suspects, the family, the friends, they had all been part of a game they couldn't even begin to understand. And now, the truth had torn it all apart. Simon fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head as the reality of his actions crushed him. The others stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and regret. But in that moment, they knew. Victor Duval had been murdered, not by an angry wife or a jealous brother, but by the one who had the most to lose, by the one who had hidden behind the mask of innocence the longest. Poirot turned, his voice quiet, but filled with finality. The truth, my friends, is often more terrifying than any lie. And in the end, it is always the secrets we try to bury that bring us to our doom. As the words hung in the air, the mansion seemed to breathe again. The silence, broken by the sound of the inevitable. The killer had been unmasked, and with that revelation, the final curtain had fallen. Chapter 12. The Truth Behind Closed Doors. The mansion was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around you like a thick blanket, suffocating every breath, every thought. It wasn't the kind of silence you could ignore. It was the silence of something waiting, something ominous. In the heart of this darkened house, where secrets had been buried for too long, Hercule Poirot stood still. His mind was sharp, his senses alert, and yet there was a sense of finality in the air, a whisper of the truth that was about to be revealed, a truth that had been locked away, hidden behind closed doors. Victor Duval was dead. The truth was out. The killer had been unmasked, but even now, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Poirot knew something was missing. The whole story had yet to be told. The motives, the betrayals, the lies, they all led him here, to this very moment, and yet there was still something more. A final twist, the kind of truth that no one could have predicted. Poirot walked through the mansion, each step deliberate, measured. He had been here before. He had seen the way the shadows clung to the corners of the rooms, the way the walls seemed to watch, listen. But today, the house felt different. It felt as if it was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to spill out, to finally shatter the facade of innocence that had covered the family for so long. The suspects, Eleanor, Vincent, Angela, and Simon, were all gathered in the drawing room, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and anticipation. Each of them had been through the ringer. Each had their story, their alibi, their excuse. But none of them had been truthful. They had all lied, manipulated, concealed, and even killed to protect themselves. But now, in the final moments, they would have to face the consequences of their actions. Poirot paused at the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. Each of them seemed to expect the truth to come from him, as if they had been waiting for the moment when he would pull the veil from their eyes. But Poirot wasn't here to simply reveal the killer. He was here to reveal something deeper, the truth behind closed doors. Please, Poirot. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with uncertainty. What are you waiting for? We know you have the answers. Tell us the truth. Poirot studied her carefully, his gaze unwavering. The truth is never as simple as we want it to be, Mademoiselle Duval. It is not always a matter of black and white. Sometimes it is a matter of what is hidden, what is kept behind closed doors. Vincent shifted uneasily in his seat, his fingers gripping the edge of the armchair. "What are you saying, Poirot?" His voice was laced with frustration. "We've been through this. You know who did it. You know who killed Victor." Poirot turned his attention to Vincent, his eyes cold. "I know many things, Monsieur Duval, but the question is not just who killed Victor. It is why. Why did it happen? And what led to it?" Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but Poirot held up a hand, silencing her. "I have listened to all of you. Each of you has a story. Each of you has an alibi. But there is something you are all overlooking. Something none of you have addressed." Angela's eyes shifted nervously from Poirot to the others. She had been the first to confess, but even now her guilt weighed heavily on her. "What do you mean? We've told you everything. We told you how it happened." Poirot took a step forward, his gaze never leaving her. "But not everything. Not the full story. You've confessed, yes, but you've kept something hidden. Something that changes everything." The room seemed to grow colder, the weight of Poirot's words settling over them like a thick fog. Each suspect was now on edge, their secrets, so carefully buried, threatening to surface. Poirot continued, his voice steady. Victor Duval was not just a victim. He was also a man who manipulated, who used people for his own gain. He knew your weaknesses. He knew your secrets. And he exploited them all. But there is one thing he didn't know, one thing he didn't see coming. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying, Poirot? What didn't Victor know?" Poirot's eyes hardened. "He didn't know the truth about you, mademoiselle. He didn't know that you were not the innocent widow you pretended to be." Eleanor's face paled. "No, that's not true. I loved Victor." Poirot's voice grew cold, cutting through her denial. "You loved him, yes, but you also hated him. You hated him for what he did to you, for the power he held over you. You were afraid of what he would do to your reputation, to your life. You were afraid he would expose your secrets." The room was still. The tension was unbearable. Eleanor's lips trembled, but she said nothing. She couldn't deny it. Poirot turned towards Simon, who had been silent for the most part. "And you, Monsieur Grant? You thought you could play the game, control the situation. You were always in the background, always watching, but you were more involved than you let on. You knew the stakes. You knew what Victor had uncovered." Simon's eyes flickered with something, guilt, fear, but he remained composed. "I had nothing to do with it, Poirot. You know I didn't." Poirot's gaze was unrelenting. "No, you didn't kill him, but you helped make his death inevitable. You kept the secret. You knew the truth about Victor's dealings, about his power, and you knew what would happen if that truth came to light." Simon's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Poirot turned toward Vincent last, the one who had seemed the most broken throughout this ordeal, the one who had been so eager to distance himself from the murder. But Poirot wasn't fooled. "Monsieur Duval," Poirot said softly, his voice tinged with finality, "you were the one who stood to lose the most. You had the most to gain from Victor's death, and yet you were the one who tried hardest to protect your family, to hide the truth. But the truth is, you were complicit. You were part of the web of deceit. You helped create the conditions that led to Victor's murder." Vincent's eyes widened, his face going pale. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Poirot's voice was firm, his gaze piercing. "You allowed it to happen. You turned a blind eye to the lies, to the manipulation. You were so focused on protecting your family, your reputation, that you ignored the truth, and in doing so, you sealed Victor's fate. There was a long silence. The weight of Poirot's words hung heavily in the air. Each of the suspects had been involved. They had all played their part in Victor's death. But the truth was still incomplete. There was still something missing, and Poirot knew what it was. He took a step forward, his voice lowering. The truth is, Victor Duval was not just killed by the one who betrayed him. He was killed by the one who loved him most. The words hung in the air like a bombshell. The faces of the suspects turned pale. Eleanor's eyes widened in horror. Poirot's gaze never wavered. The killer, the one who pulled the trigger, the one who made the final choice, was you, Mademoiselle Duval. You killed him to stop him from destroying everything you had built. You killed him to keep your own secret safe. Eleanor's mouth dropped open in disbelief, her body trembling. She stumbled back, her hand pressing against the wall as if to hold herself up. No, that's not possible. I didn't kill him. I couldn't. Poirot stepped closer, his voice calm but unyielding. You had no choice. Victor had crossed a line. He had threatened to expose you, to ruin you, and when he realized the truth about your involvement in his business dealings, when he knew you were part of the web you so carefully constructed, you knew that he had to die, to protect yourself, to protect your family. Eleanor's face crumpled, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed to her face as she cried out in despair. Poirot stood over her, his gaze unwavering. The truth, Mademoiselle Duval, is that Victor Duval's death was not just a crime of passion. It was a crime of survival. You killed him to protect yourself from the very man who had controlled you for so long. And now, the truth is out. The room was silent. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. And in that silence, Poirot knew that the truth, finally exposed, had shattered everything. As Eleanor's sobs filled the room, the rest of the suspects stood frozen, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. But the truth was undeniable. The killer had been hiding behind closed doors all along, and now there was nowhere left to run.